Thank you, Mr. President. We commend the Slovenian presidency for convening this important debate, and we are privileged to see former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon amongst us today. And I'm grateful to his briefing and clarity of thought, as always. We could agree to much of what he has said, the multitude of challenges and the best ways of addressing them, cooperation, diplomacy, respect for international law, and compliance with global agreements and obligations, and inclusive reform are the key words there. And let me also thank Ms. Dayal for her presentation. President, this is a time of exceptional global turbulence. Conflicts are raging with devastating humanitarian consequences. Violations of the UN Charter and international law are becoming disturbingly routine. Geopolitical rivalries, foreign occupation, terrorism, hate speech, and widening inequalities are undermining global stability. At the same time, combined shocks of debt distress, climate emergencies, and slowing growth have reversed the hard-won development gains, particularly impacting the global south. And confidence in multilateral institutions is eroding, and the international order we inherited is under serious stress. At such a moment, principled leadership is indispensable. It requires responsibility, vision, political courage, moral clarity, and fidelity to the principles of the UN Charter. Peace cannot be sustained through selective application of international law or through silence in the face of violations. A leadership for peace must be anchored in prevention, dialogue, cooperation, and effective multilateralism, including the full use of regional arrangements under Chapter 8. The Pact for the Future reaffirmed our collective commitment to multilateralism and the 2030 Agenda. Yet, words alone will not deliver peace. More than 100 developing countries face a growing SDG financing gap. Failure to address this gap will deepen instability and conflict. Leadership demands urgent action through concessional finance, debt relief, and fulfillment of long-standing development commitments. Leadership for peace also requires a strong and proactive Secretary General. Article 99 of the Charter must be used as an early preventive tool, not as a last resort. Pakistan appreciates the clear, bold, and principled positions taken by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Independence, integrity, and sound judgment, among others, are qualities member states would look for also in the next Secretary General, who would be expected to strengthen all three pillars of the United Nations equally and exercise good offices proactively and without fear or favor. And President, while demanding such high standards in the Secretary General, the member states must also live up to their own obligations under the Charter, its purposes and principles, and particularly Article 25, wherein all member states, and I quote, agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. We cannot tie the hands of the Secretary General, violate the Security Council resolutions, and sideline the UN, and then expect the Secretary General and the UN to deliver. In line with its charter responsibility, the Security Council itself must demonstrate leadership through consistency and credibility. That entails greater focus on conflict prevention, addressing the root causes of conflict, as well as strengthening and more effective use of the UN's peacekeeping and peace-building capacities. The Council's Resolution 2788 reaffirmed the primacy of peaceful settlement of disputes. These tools must be actively employed to resolve festering conflicts and long-standing disputes without selectivity and double standards. There should be full use of the International Court of Justice. The Council must help secure compliance with ICJ's rulings and also consider extending the Court's jurisdiction to all issues on the Council's agenda. Pakistan seeks peace and stability in South Asia, but peace cannot be a unilateral pursuit. Jammu and Kashmir remains one of the oldest unresolved disputes on the Council's agenda. It requires a just settlement in accordance with the UN Charter, relevant Security Council resolutions, and the will of the Kashmiri people, something that India continues to violate and deny. India's unilateral suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, which is a rare and enduring example of successful diplomacy, is yet another blatant breach of international obligations that undermines regional stability and endangers the lives and livelihoods of millions in our region. The Security Council must treat all disputes on its agenda with equal seriousness. When dialogue is rejected or the Secretary General's good offices are blocked, and bilateralism cannot serve as an excuse for inaction. The Council has a clear responsibility to uphold international law and ensure implementation of its own resolutions. From Gaza and other conflicts in the Middle East to Ukraine to Sudan and other situations in Africa, peace can be realized only with willing and committed parties demonstrating leadership and readiness to comply with international law. Our collective desire for a more effective and fit-for-purpose United Nations also requires visionary and responsible leadership. Sovereign equality, democracy, representation, and accountability are the principles that underpin such reform. And in our view, the answer lies in revitalizing the role of the General Assembly on one hand and addressing the fundamental issues confronting the Security Council on the other hand, including the use of veto as pointed out by Mr. Ban Ki-moon. Experience tells us that adding new individual permanent members, hypothetically that is, will only entrench paralysis and exacerbate this problem. It is besides the fact that this demand is unfeasible and thus the biggest roadblock to reform. The Uniting for Consensus proposal offers a practical, inclusive, and achievable model based on elected seats that provide for rotation, enhanced regional and cross-regional representation, and better accountability to the general membership. Reform for all, privilege for none. That's our motto. President, no nation can secure peace alone. It is a collective endeavor, requiring leadership, cooperation, and genuine multilateralism. Pakistan will continue to work with all member states to uphold the UN Charter, advance justice and rule of law, and stand for a vibrant multilateral system that delivers for all peace, dignity, and shared prosperity. I thank you.
Madam President, India would like to congratulate Slovenia for assuming the Council's presidency and thank them for convening today's open debate. I also thank His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, for his insightful briefing as also the external briefer for her remarks. The theme of today's open debate, leadership for peace, and the guiding questions are particularly pertinent in the current context. The establishment of the United Nations was rooted in the desire of member states to achieve sustainable peace. Consequently, maintenance of international peace and security became its central pillar, and the United Nations Security Council was primarily entrusted with this onerous task. Inability of the Council to purposefully intervene in today's raging conflicts in different regions has deeply disappointed our citizens who question UN's legitimacy, efficacy, credibility, and relevance. The next Secretary General would therefore assume charge at a critical juncture for this organization. In this backdrop, India would like to make the following points. First, the primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security rests with the Council and its membership, especially the permanent members who have been continuously represented over the past 8 decades in the Council. When their approaches were focused on global public goods, the chances of peace prevailing have brightened. When their approaches focused on narrower national interest, chances of peace have dimmed. The quality and focus of the leadership displayed by members of the Council thus represents the most important aspect, impinging on maintenance of international peace and security. Second, structural and systemic elements in the 8-decade-old architecture of the Council act as retardants in efforts to maintain international peace and security. The current Security Council configuration is largely frozen in time. As Secretary General Guterres noted, and I quote, "We can't create a future fit for our grandchildren with systems built for our grandparents." Reforming the Security Council to make it fit for purpose to tackle contemporary challenges is an urgent global imperative. The intergovernmental negotiations framework launched for Council reform, which has largely remained barren and bereft of productive outcomes, must move towards time-bound, text-based negotiations at the earliest to enhance representation from underrepresented and unrepresented geographies in tune with today's realities in both the permanent and elected categories of membership. Third, leadership for peace should be the guiding mantra for the ongoing UN 80 reforms initiative to enhance efficiency, effectiveness, and relevance of the UN and multilateral system. This is not a one-shot process, but a continuing effort that would pass on to the new Secretary General, who would be called upon not only to address present challenges, but also to reinvigorate multilateralism. Fourth, the new Secretary General must embody the aspirations of the overwhelming majority of humanity, who are from developing countries of the Global South. These aspirations largely cover the development spectrum and pertain to ensuring the basic minimum of living standards, and cover areas such as financing for development, climate equity and justice, achieving SDGs, overseas development assistance, etc. Fifth, leadership by definition must be inclusive for it to be representative, legitimate, and effective. Appointments of senior UN leadership must follow a transparent and objective process rather than a division of spoils approach. No post should become the exclusive and continuing preserve of some member states. Sixth, India takes note of the recent efforts by the large majority of member states to bring in greater transparency and predictability in the election process of UN Secretary General, as also evidenced in the negotiations on UN General Assembly Resolution 79/327. Madam President, before I conclude, I refer to the statement made by the representative of Pakistan today. India would like to reiterate that the Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh are an integral and inalienable part of India. They were, are, and will always remain so. Pakistan's unwarranted reference to Jammu and Kashmir in today's open debate attests to its obsessive focus on harming India and its people. A serving non-permanent Security Council member that chooses to further this obsession in all meetings and platforms of the UN in pursuit of its divisive agenda cannot be expected to fulfill its designated responsibilities and obligations. India had entered into the Indus Waters Treaty 65 years ago in good faith, in a spirit of goodwill and friendship. Throughout these 6.5 decades, Pakistan has violated the spirit of the treaty by inflicting 3 wars and thousands of terror attacks on India. In the last 4 decades, tens of thousands of Indian lives have been lost in Pakistan-sponsored terror attacks, the most recent of which was a Pahalgam terror attack in April 2025, which involved religion-based targeted killings of 26 innocent civilians by Pakistan-sponsored terrorists. It is in this backdrop that India has finally announced that the treaty will be held in abeyance until Pakistan, which is a global epicenter of terror, credibly and irrevocably ends its support for cross-border and all other forms of terrorism. Pakistan, of course, has a unique way of respecting the will of its people by jailing a prime minister, by banning the ruling political party, and by letting its armed forces engineer a constitutional coup through the 27th Amendment and giving lifetime immunity to its Chief of Defense Forces. Let me be clear. India will counter Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in all its forms and manifestations with all its might. Madam President, in closing, with abiding faith in multilateralism, India reiterates that we stand ready to contribute towards working for peace, security, and prosperity for all. I thank you, Madam President.